Senator Amy Klobuchar and Jennifer Palmieri.
Good morning, everybody.
Hello.
Senator Klobuchar, good morning.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. You are from Minnesota, and it's a politically diverse state.
Thank you, one person.
And you're not the only person, as it turns out, you're not the only person from Minnesota.
No.
It's a politically diverse state. It's a state that Clinton won, didn't do as well in the other Midwestern states. This is can be pretty tough territory or treacherous territory for Democrats. There was a Minneapolis Star-Tribune poll recently that had your approval rating at 72%, begging the question, why is Amy Klobuchar so awesome? But how do you tell us a little bit about how you navigate that state that is pretty divided, and do you think there's lessons that are applicable for progressives writ large?
Well, I think first of all, you see a number of people like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, who are able, despite their states voting differently in the presidential election, are able to navigate it. And I think one of the things that we do is, first of all, not be afraid to go anywhere or talk about any issue with our constituents. We don't leave people behind. I actually visit all 87 counties in Minnesota every single year. I'm on my 12th year. I've gotten to the point where in some counties I've been visiting places just recently called Insect Inferno. Let's kill bed bugs with heat. That was one of the businesses. And I use that as an example because we were kind of out of places to visit in the county. And they did make me go inside a semi that had Let's kill bed bugs with heat on the outside. And then they turned up the heat, but only halfway, where they put the mattresses and things. And it reminded me of what actually a Republican candidate for president who didn't make it once said, you go not just where it's comfortable, but where it's uncomfortable. So I think a lot of what we need to do in the Democratic Party is make sure we're reaching out to people in every town and not just considering them to a place where, oh, you don't win those counties or those regions, so we don't go there. And I think that was a bit of what we learned from the presidential race, but it's certainly been a strategy of our winning candidates in some of the rural areas. And I think talking to them and figuring that out and having an economic agenda that includes everyone is going to be very important in the coming elections.
And do you find, if you've been doing that for 12 years, people feel they've been heard, they've been listened to, or do you find you do actually have these uncomfortable moments?
Well, right. You get to know them. You get to know all the elected officials, some of which are kind of nonpartisan, right? It doesn't say it on the ballot. Maybe people think they're Republicans, but they just are people you get to know as friends, and it's a way different way of relating to people than we might in more partisan settings.
Yes, you seem to make a lot of progress using humor.
That's right.
Yes. And you're on the Rural Economic Subcommittee of the Senate Ag Committee. So, and I know that you and your staff take this very seriously, spend a lot of time in different parts of Minnesota and doing, tours on the rural economy. Say a little bit about what you think those elements are, because I think in the, traditionally people hear rural and they just think ag, and Minnesota is this very diverse state. So, what do you think that those elements are?
Yeah, so I'm on the Agriculture Committee, and our state is 5th in the country for ag. So I've spent a lot of time on the farm bills, successful farm bills under 2 different presidents, and that's been very important. And I think people should think about that, not just because of the ag aspect of it, but also the child nutrition aspect and some of the conservation programs in those bills. And our Democratic Party has to get strongly behind them. But it is so much more than just talking about the Farm Bill when you think about rural America. It's rural economic development. And as I look at what's coming at us with technology and robots and some of the changes that we're going to see, I think, well, how do we resolve that? And how do we make sure there's jobs in the future? The first obvious answer is training people for the jobs that we have now and that we will have in the future. But the second one is continuing this great entrepreneurial American focus on new businesses, small businesses, startups, and this is where I get to rural. One of the easier places to start some of these new businesses are places where there's a lower cost of living, whether it was when Spam Hormel started in southern Minnesota, which, by the way, I urge you to visit, home of the world's only Spam Museum, or as we call it, the Guggenheim. Right? Or whether it's like new, more modern companies like Epicurean that makes cutting boards up in Duluth. So to try to harness that kind of energy and entrepreneurial spirit, as a lot of younger people want to move places like a Duluth, where there is kind of a culture developing of entrepreneurship is important. So how do you do it? One, they've got to have Wi-Fi. You can't have this digital divide. You can't have doctors in northern Minnesota that if they want to look at their x-rays have to go to the McDonald's parking lot if they don't want to go to the hospital. That is a true fact. You cannot have kids on tribal lands who one house gets Wi-Fi and he looks out his window and all these other kids are doing the homework in the front yard. That's a true digital divide. And so one, that is a thing we need to resolve, and we have a package of infrastructure. Two, rural hospitals, hurt horribly by these budget that is proposed with the Medicaid cuts coming out of the health care bill in the House. The third would be making sure we have educational opportunities available. And then I would also say that the whole budget, when you look at it, you've got to look at it in terms of rural America. So you can look at this divide. One of my favorite suggested budget cuts from this administration to point to is the limit on home heating, right? Tom Daschle would tell you that in South Dakota and Minnesota it gets kind of cold. Note to administration, not everyone can go to Florida, can afford to do that every weekend. So looking at how we do the budget as a statement of values that includes everyone in the country.
You have an interesting way, because I think there are understandable reasons for why there's so much anxiety in the country, right? We've had 2 decades of extraordinary change. We had 9/11, we've had 2 wars, we had the Great Recession, we've had big changes in demographics, digital economy, globalization. So there's reason for people to feel extraordinary anxiety, and we've had a good recovery in terms of duration, but not everybody feels it. So what I think is the approach that, and you and I talked about this yesterday, but the approach that you have articulated, I think sort of like flips this question on its head, as opposed to what are the opportunities for people? It's not as if everyone in Duluth is going to become an engineer or a coder, but I think we're all looking for ways that you can harness. This is what we do in America, right? We face big forces, there's a lot of disruption, and then we figure out how to make those forces work for us. But what you're suggesting is, yes, not everyone's going to be an engineer or a coder in Duluth, but you can attract talent that is sort of an anchor in the community, and the community grows from that. So talk some more about that, because it's really the first time I've heard somebody articulate it from that perspective, and you can see how it would work, which is encouraging.
Well, and I commend CAP for the new Marshall Plan that you guys have put out, because it really gets to some of those ideas. And I think when, as Democrats, we go into areas and we say, oh, hey, everyone needs a 4-year degree. Well, that's just not true. There are people that don't want to follow that path, and we have to, I'm going to get this, allow for different paths for people to follow. My Marco Rubio moment. There you go.
So much more grace.
Thank you, Jen. We have to allow for different paths for people to follow. And in my sister's case, she never graduated from high school, say in suburban Minnesota. She ended up moving down to Iowa, worked in some plants, did things like that, and then finally went on to get her GED and a 2-year degree, right? Then she went on later after that, she got her 4-year degree and ended up being an accountant. Those stories are all over America, and they don't always end with a 4-year degree. Sometimes they end with a good job in welding. Sometimes they end with someone who has a job repairing robotics equipment. So as a Democratic Party, I think it's really important we stand up for this simple idea that not all paths are the same. And that right now we have all this need for welders and people to do some of the jobs and in the trades where we have an aging population. And I think that's one way, when you look at the CAP report, to reach out across all kinds of divides, whether they're geographic, whether they're racial, whatever they are in our country, to include everyone in this progress.
Yeah, it's good. It's really encouraging. So we've learned some more pretty disturbing news about the president in the last 24 hours. I haven't checked in the last. Okay,
We'll just go with the last
24 hours. Last
Yeah.
3 hours. Okay. You're on the Judiciary Committee. You're a former prosecutor. I know you support a special prosecutor for Russia as well as an independent commission. Just, how are you thinking about processing the latest news and where Senate, as a Senate Democrat, where you think we take this from here?
Yeah, well, first on the latest news, I think it's really important that clearly if there is some kind of a readout from that meeting and a transcript, that means there's probably a tape, unless they had someone in there, So we need to get a hold of that. Obviously, the classified information should be redacted, but when you have the President of the United States allegedly disclosing secret information, as our function in the Senate is oversight of intelligence agencies, oversight of the Justice Department. We need to get a hold of that because, one, it's a risk to our intelligence and our agents out in the field. 2, it's a risk to our relationship with allies. And 3, it's putting people in danger. One of the reasons that presidents are so careful when they look at disclosing classified information is that you never know the next level down of where that source came from or how it was done. That is why when President Reagan disclosed that the Russians had shot down a plane and decided he thought that would be better for the country to understand that, he actually worked with our intelligence agencies to figure it out. So we have to get to the bottom of this. How does this relate to the bigger picture of what's going on? I always echoing in my mind is what former Director Klobuchar said before our Judiciary Committee last week. And he said that we are simply emboldening Russia. We're emboldening them when we don't take this seriously, when we're not investigating what's happened. And by giving this classified information to them that they didn't even give to the senators at the laptop briefing that I attended at 8:30 in the morning, that emboldens Russia. So I get really back to where I start, which is that we need a special prosecutor appointed by the Justice Department to get to the bottom of what happened. All of the standards of that rule have been met. We also need an independent commission, because if you want to stop this from happening again in the future, look at what the 9/11 Commission did. They were able to put out some rules of the road so that if there is a breach in the middle of a major presidential campaign, that there is some suggestions and maybe even agreement on what people do when they get that information. What does the media do? Look at how the media just handled it in the French elections. They didn't immediately put things out in a radioactive manner because it was a cyber attack from another country. So I think both of those things, getting to the bottom of the connections between the Trump campaign and Russia, when we have 17 intelligence agencies telling us that Russia tried to get involved in our election, influence our election, is critical. But it's equally critical that we put some rules of the road in place so this doesn't happen again.
Okay, all right. Thank you. That's all we have time for. We really appreciate
thank you. It was great to be on. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Donald Sussman.